Tonight we're going to look at Luke chapter 6, and we're going to focus on verses 1 through 11. We're in this large section of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. That's where he begins his ministry when he was here on earth. And it begins with a summary. It will end when Jesus says, "I'm going to Jerusalem." So that will end the ministry in Galilee, and Jesus will make the journey to Jerusalem. The launch of the ministry in chapters 4 and the first part of chapter 5 focuses upon the reception that Jesus has among the people. And Jesus has a bad reception in Nazareth, of all places, because he grew up there. And the people wanted Jesus to put on a show, do a lot of miracles. But the people had no faith. They looked at Jesus as a carpenter, not a rabbi, and certainly not the Messiah, even though in Jesus' speech to them, he pretty much told them he was the Messiah, if they were paying attention. And then Jesus, perceiving their lack of faith, tells stories about how when Israel lacked faith, God turned to the Gentiles. And that didn't set very well with the people of Nazareth. In fact, they run Jesus out of town and want to kill him before all is said and done. The next town that Jesus goes to is Capernaum, and things go much better in Capernaum. So wonderful in Capernaum that those people want Jesus to move there and stay there permanently, because Jesus does do many miracles in Capernaum, and he teaches them, and they love him. So there's that contrast. Most of the people love Jesus, but there are some that don't. Now we turn to the section we're in right now, the beginning of controversy. This is Jesus' relationship with the religious establishment, with the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. How does Jesus get along with them? And the answer is not so well. In fact, there's 5 controversy stories that Luke strings one right after the other. You can find those same 5 stories in Mark chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6. So that was Luke's source for these stories. And like Mark, he just lists them one right after the other. The first controversy is over Jesus' ability to forgive sins. And this is one of the most fascinating stories in the New Testament about the paralyzed man and his 4 friends, who believe if they can just get their friend to Jesus, that Jesus will heal him. Well, there's so many people surrounding Jesus, they can't get to him. So what do? They climb up on the roof of somebody's house and actually lower the man down through the roof right in front of Jesus. And I'm sure Jesus started laughing when he saw it. And then he noticed their great faith that they had. And we would expect Jesus to say, you have such great faith. Just get up, take up your mattress, walk, and go home. But instead, Jesus says your sins are forgiven. And the Pharisees said, "Whoa, how can he say that? Only God can forgive sins," which is true. But they never put 2 and 2 together, that Jesus just might be the Son of God, that he was God in the flesh. That never occurred to them, so they accused him of blasphemy. And then a couple of the stories that Mike talked about last week. One is Jesus' association with tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees believed that who you hung around with mattered. And the Pharisees would only hang out with people who were pretty much like them. People dedicated to the law, people who were following the law letter by letter. But Jesus hangs out with tax collectors and sinners. In fact, Jesus calls Levi, who's a tax collector, to be one of the 12. Levi's other name is Matthew. And then Matthew invites Jesus over to his house for a banquet. And Matthew also invites his tax collector friends and sinner friends to come to the banquet as well. And the Pharisees throw a fit. How can he do that? If he's really a prophet from God, he should not be hanging out with those people. But Jesus says it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Jesus says, I've come to help them. And if you're a true religious leader, as you think you are, you should want to help them too. You should want them to be healed spiritually, but instead you ignore them. You cast them aside. So that association with sinners creates conflict with the religious establishment. And then there's this controversy because Jesus' disciples are not fasting. It kind of gives us some insight into the life of a Pharisee. It wasn't a very happy life. In fact, they would fast 2 days a week on Mondays and Thursdays just to show to people how religious they are. And when they fasted, they just moaned and groaned about it so everybody would know they're fasting. And Jesus says, no, that's not how you do it. And Jesus goes on to say that my disciples don't fast because he uses the illustration of a bridegroom. You know, when the bridegroom's friends are with him, they don't fast, they feast. You know, the wedding ceremony is not a time to fast. It's a time for celebration. And as long as he's with the disciples, they're not going to fast. They're going to celebrate his goodness, his love, his forgiveness, his mercy, his grace. One day they will fast when I'm taken away from them, Jesus said. And when Jesus is arrested and crucified, that changed everything for the disciples. That was the time of hiding. That was the time of mourning. That was the time of wondering if they've just wasted the last 3 years of their life. But after the resurrection, we don't find the church so much fasting, but celebrating. Jesus is alive. He's risen. Now we get it. Now we understand what he did. He died for our sins and rose again to give us forgiveness and eternal life. So with Jesus, it's a life of celebration. It's not a somber life. It's a life of praising God for his grace and for all he's done for us. Well, tonight we're going to look at controversy story number 4 and number 5. And what they have in common is they both are about the Sabbath day. 2 controversy stories related to the Sabbath. And in the first story, in chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, Jesus is going to make the claim that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Boy, that was a big clue as to who he was, if they were able to understand. And since he is the Lord of the Sabbath, in the second story, in verses 6 through 11, Jesus will heal a man on the Sabbath day. And we're going to look at why Jesus did that and why the Pharisees were so upset that he did that. Now, there's really no chronological connection between the stories. In fact, there's really no chronological connection between the 5 stories. But there is a bit of a thematic issue that kind of binds them together. If you're a follower of Jesus, the bridegroom, you feast instead of fast. You rejoice instead of mourn. And this theme of gladness, not sadness, also spills over into how you celebrate the Sabbath day. You see, the Pharisees had turned the Sabbath day, which should have been a day of celebration, a day of rest, a day of rejoicing, into a day that was a day of drudgery. It was a day of, be careful you don't do something you're not supposed to do. You know, there's all these laws, and be careful not to step over the line and violate the Sabbath day. So instead of being this day of celebration, it was a day of watching out for everybody to make sure they don't do something wrong. And it turned it into a not so great celebration. Well, all 4 Gospels make it quite clear that Jesus' controversy with the Pharisees over the Sabbath day was a big deal. Who gets to determine how the Sabbath gets celebrated? And the Pharisees had their ideas, and Jesus had his ideas, and they were completely different. Now, the Sabbath was very important to the Jewish people. They looked at it as sacred. They were the only people group in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament that celebrated a Sabbath day. If you were to ask any Gentile about the Sabbath, they would look at you like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But for the Jewish people, God had set it up, really since the day of creation, that you were to work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. That's what God did in creating the world. He created the world in 6 days. He rested on the seventh day. And it's a clue that God has created people in such a way that we can work hard for 6 days. But then we need a day of rest. And that day of rest was for our good. It was to refresh us, a chance to unwind, a chance to let the stress go, a chance to recuperate. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. And how many people in our culture who violate that all the time have health problems, psychological problems, all kinds of issues because they don't allow their body to rest. So this was for our good. God said, I created you in such a way. You can go really hard for 6 days, but on the seventh day, you just need to unwind and rest. Now, most of these people were farmers, which meant you worked the fields for 6 days. But on the seventh, you avoided the field. You worshiped. You rested. You spent time with your family. And you recuperated so that you were ready after the Sabbath day to go hard again for 6 more days. It was also true back in 175 BC that a Greek leader by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes decided that everyone under his leadership should practice Greek customs and only Greek customs. So Antiochus Epiphanes said to the Jewish people, you have to give up your customs, which means you had to give up the Sabbath. You had to give up circumcision. You had to give up the worship of your God and worship the gods of the Greeks. Well, as you can imagine, that went over like a lead balloon. The Jewish people fought against that. In fact, there was a group of people called the Maccabees who rebelled against all of that and led a rebellion in which Israel, for a period of time, actually won its freedom. That was in 175 BC. When Antiochus came to power. Many Jewish people lost their lives fighting for their rights, fighting for the Sabbath day, fighting for circumcision, fighting for their religious freedom to worship the God of heaven. So by the time we get to Jesus' day, you don't mess with the Sabbath because it's sacred. And 3 generations ago, somebody in my family died defending the Sabbath day. That's how the Jewish people felt about it. Then the Jewish rabbis decided, well, God said to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And God said to work for 6 days and rest on the Sabbath. So what does it mean to not work on the Sabbath? And they answered that in their writings. It was very rigorous. It was very strict. It was very severe. And it took all the joy out of the Sabbath celebration. And Jesus comes along and he doesn't just say, you guys have gone too far in all of your rules and regulations. Jesus says, your problem is you've missed the point of the Sabbath altogether. The point of the Sabbath was not for God to restrict your behavior. It was supposed to be for your good. In fact, to do good on the Sabbath day is something you ought to do. You don't really need permission to do good things on the Sabbath day. That should just be automatic in terms of what you should do. So, on the Sabbath day. It's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to help another person. It's okay to do good things on the Sabbath. And that's where Jesus and the religious leaders are going to butt heads. The religious leaders are saying, we've got these rules. And Jesus says, no, God didn't mean for you to have all of those rules. Those are your rules, not God's. God wants you to enjoy the Sabbath day. Be refreshed. Spend time with family. Help somebody. Do something good on the Sabbath day. And that's the conflict that we're about to read about. Well, let me read the first story, and then we'll talk about it. It's in Luke chapter 6. It's in verses 1 through 5. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some of the heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Well, let's take a look at that story as it breaks down. It starts in chapter 6, verse 1, and Luke says it happened one Sabbath. So he doesn't give us any details about which Sabbath or even where it happened. It's a possibility that this happened somewhere in Capernaum, but we're not really sure. But it happened on a Sabbath day when Jesus and his disciples were walking through the grain fields. Life was interesting back in Old Testament times and also in the first century. They did have some roads, and the Romans were known for building roads, but often there were not roads. So to get from point A to point B, you would often walk through somebody's field. In this case, somebody's grain field. And it was okay to do that. There were no laws, trespassing laws saying you can't walk through my field. In fact, according to Jewish law, if you owned the field, you could harvest most of it, but you were to leave some behind for the poor, who could just come and take what they needed in order to survive. Also for travelers who walked through your fields, if they get hungry, it was permissible to take some of the grain and eat it. So all of that was kind of part of normal life for the Jewish people. So the accusation is not that the disciples were stealing grain, because they weren't. It was just common practice. If you were walking through a field and you got hungry, you were allowed to pick some of the grain. Obviously, you wouldn't bring a big bushel basket because that would be stealing, but you could take what you could eat at that moment and move on. So that's what they do, and they begin to pick some of the heads of grain. They rub them in their hands, and they eat the kernels. And the idea is, most likely, they got hungry. You're walking through the grain field, and you go, wow, there's food here. I think I'm hungry. It's kind of like today when you go to the grocery store when you're hungry. I mean, everything looks good. And you go, I haven't tried that in a while. I need one of those, and I need one of those. And pretty soon you've got a whole basket full of groceries that you're bringing home because you're hungry and everything looks good. So as they're going through the grain field, they're thinking, hey, I must be hungry, so I'm going to help myself to the grain. The issue is they did this on the Sabbath day. And so some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And notice that Luke says some of the Pharisees. He does that on purpose, because in the Gospel of Luke, almost every time he mentions the Pharisees, they're bad. But in the book of Acts, all of a sudden the Pharisees are pretty sympathetic toward Christianity. In fact, some of the Pharisees helped Paul basically save his life at one point. Some of the Pharisees are good in the book of Acts, and some of them even become Christians. Most notably, the Apostle Paul, who was a leading Pharisee, becomes a Christian. So not all Pharisees are bad, especially in the book of Acts. In the gospel, they're pretty much bad. But in the book of Acts, many of them are good. So what's the accusation? Well, as we look at what the Jewish people believed about the Sabbath, they took it seriously. And the logic of the Pharisees goes something like this. Isn't work forbidden on the Sabbath day? And the answer is yes. It says in Exodus, work 6 days, rest on the seventh. Don't work on day 7. So yes, they're correct in that. And then the Pharisees would say, haven't our rabbis drawn up a catalog of 39 acts of work, all of which are forbidden on the Sabbath day? And if you want to see that list of 39, you can Google this. It's at Shabbat chapter 7, verse 2. And if you'll type in Shabbat 7:2, it'll come right up. And you can read the list of all 39 things that are forbidden on the Sabbath day. Now, the problem is the Pharisees were equating what their rabbis wrote with what God said. God said, don't work on the Sabbath day. But God did not give the list of 39 things you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath day. The rabbis created that list. And we find out that Jesus obeys everything God says. But Jesus often disagrees with what the rabbis have to say. So what God said, yes, we're to follow that. What the rabbis have said, we don't have to follow that. This is just their laws, their regulations. In fact, they called them the oral tradition. It wasn't until later that they actually wrote them down. They passed them along by word of mouth until everybody knew what the Pharisees were teaching. So according to this list of 39 things that are no-nos on the Sabbath day, the disciples are guilty. In fact, they're guilty of 4 acts that they're not supposed to do on the Sabbath day. The first one is they pick grain, and that's reaping or harvesting. Not really, but they would say that. Then they rub the grain in their hands, and that's threshing, also forbidden on the Sabbath day. They throw away the husk, and that's winnowing. And then they eat the grain, and that is preparing food on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do that either. You're supposed to prepare your food the day before. So, did the disciples really break the Sabbath day? Are they really guilty of doing that? Well, the Pharisees have taken God's law, which was supposed to be for our benefit, and made it so strict and so restrictive that it took all the joy out of it. That was the issue. In one mouthful, the disciples are guilty of 4 things, the Pharisees would say, and Jesus isn't doing anything about it. Well, Jesus decides to answer. And even though the accusation is against the disciples, Jesus answers on their behalf. And he takes responsibility for what they did. And Jesus does what he often does. He's going to ask a question, a counter question. Jesus said, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? So Jesus is going to refer to a story about David that's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. David is on the run from King Saul. King Saul has been told by God that David is the next king of Israel. And Saul says, not if I kill him first. And so Saul decides to kill David because Saul wants his son Jonathan to be the next king. So David is a fugitive. David is on the run. He has to stay one step ahead of King Saul or he's going to lose his life. So David's on the run, and he ends up at a shrine in a town called Nob. And there's a priest there by the name of Elimelech. And David tells him, I've got some followers in a secret place, and I'm on a secret mission from the king. He lied. If he would have told the truth, he would have said, I've got some guys with me. They're my fighting men. Their goal is to keep me alive, and I'm on the run from the king. That would have been the truth. Well, he entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. So David goes up to the priest and says, we're hungry. We're famished. We're starving to death. We need food. Can you give me 5 loaves? And the priest says, no, I can't give you 5 loaves, but here's what I can give you. There's actually 12 loaves. And it's the consecrated bread. It's the bread that's in the tabernacle, on the table of showbread. And I can give you that. Now, the priests are supposed to eat this, and only the priest. But under the circumstances, I'm willing to give you this bread. Now, in the tabernacle, the table of showbread was in the holy place. And in the holy place, only priests were allowed to enter. If you were not a priest, you could not go into the holy place. And right next to the holy place, right next to this bread, was the Holy of Holies. And that's where Israel said the presence of God lived. So this was a very sacred place, and the bread was considered sacred. There were 12 loaves, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the bread represented the fellowship, the relationship between God and the people of Israel. It was their constant fellowship. So every Sabbath day, the 12 loaves get replaced with 12 fresh loaves of bread. The old bread is then eaten by the priests. It's part of their payment for being a priest. But in comes David, and he convinces the priest to give him the consecrated bread. He takes it, he shares it with his fighting men. They all eat it, even though the law of God said only priests can eat that bread. Now, it's interesting that David's physical condition, the fact that he was famished, seemed to have overridden the law of God. That somehow, because David was really hungry, he could somehow eat that bread and it was okay. In fact, in the story, nobody condemns David for what he did. The priest doesn't say anything. Other people don't say anything. Even God doesn't say a thing. It seems to be okay for David to do that. And here's what Jesus is getting at. Jesus is drawing a comparison between himself and King David, who wasn't quite king at that point, although he was anointed to be the next king. So David had his fighting men, and Jesus had his disciples. Both were hungry. That's why they were eating something that somebody thought they shouldn't be eating. We're not told in the story that it was the Sabbath day, but it might have been because the priest was so willing to give up the bread. And maybe he was so willing to give it up because he knew fresh bread was going to be put out anyways. So I can give you this bread that's supposed to be for me and my fellow priest. We'll get food elsewhere. You can take this bread. It was the Sabbath day when the disciples ate the bread. And David's men ate the consecrated bread, and Jesus' disciples simply ate the grain from somebody's field. And Jesus' point is this. If it's okay for David to get away with what he did, it's okay for me and my disciples to do what we did. If David can do it, so can the son of David do it. If David can do this, so can the Messiah do that as well. So that's his argument. And then to make sure everybody understands what he said, Jesus just comes out and says it. Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Jesus called himself the Son of Man, which in many ways, it could just simply mean I. That's another way to look at it. Jesus could have said, "I am the Lord of the Sabbath." That's one way to look at it. But there was that prophetic figure in Daniel chapter 7, who was a figure of the Messiah, the one who would come and establish an everlasting kingdom. And he's called the Son of Man. And I believe Jesus used that title because a lot of Jewish people would have not connected the dots. But it was a way for Jesus to say, "I'm the Messiah." And it's another way for Jesus to hint at the fact that I'm the Son of God, because that figure in Daniel chapter 7 appears to be divine. So Jesus says, "I, the Son of Man, am Lord of the Sabbath." Oh, wait a second. God created the Sabbath. So if God created the Sabbath, it's his law, it's his regulations. How can anybody be Lord of that? Unless you were God. I mean, if God made the law, certainly the Son of God could be Lord of the Sabbath. Here's the big question. Who gets to decide how the Sabbath gets celebrated? And the Pharisees would say, "Oh, we've got a list." In fact, we've got a long list of what you can do and not do on the Sabbath. But Jesus says, no. I get to decide. I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of God, so I get to decide what you can and cannot do on the Sabbath day. Now, Luke at this point doesn't tell us how the Pharisees respond. But I'm sure they were looking at each other going, "What did he say? I mean, did he just say what I think he said? Is he claiming to be God? Is he claiming that he and he alone gets to decide how the Sabbath gets celebrated?" Yeah, he was doing that. That brings us to the fifth and final controversy, which also involves the Sabbath. If Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, that means he can do healing miracles on the Sabbath day. If he's Lord of the Sabbath, he gets to decide what's right and appropriate for the Sabbath day, and healing, according to Jesus, is a good thing to do on the Sabbath day. Now, the rabbis did not object to healing on the Sabbath if the person's life was in jeopardy. If it's a matter of life and death, you can break the Sabbath and do whatever is necessary to save that person's life. In fact, in the Jewish writings, it says, whenever there is a doubt whether life is in danger, this overrides the Sabbath. So, let's put this in a modern context. If you're having heart pains, a heart attack, it's okay to do surgery on the Sabbath. But if you've got a broken bone, if you need a knee replacement or a hip replacement, if you have a severe kidney stone, it's just going to have to wait till the Sabbath is over. So if it's a matter of life and death, yes, we'll take care of that. But if it's not a matter of life and death, you've got to wait till the Sabbath is over. That was the thinking of the Pharisees. But Jesus is going to come along and say, it's always the right thing to do, which is to do good on the Sabbath day, not evil. Do the right thing on the Sabbath day. Do something that benefits another person on the Sabbath day. That's going to be the center of the conflict in this final story. So let me read that, and then we'll talk about it. It's in verses 6 through 11. And it says, "On another Sabbath, Jesus went into the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Get up and stand in front of everyone.' So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?' He looked around at them all, then said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus." So another conflict that happens on another Sabbath day. And again, Luke doesn't tell us when this happened. He doesn't tell us when it happened in relation to the previous story. This was just another story that happened on a Sabbath day. And Jesus was in the synagogue, which we would expect Jesus to be in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. In fact, he's even teaching that day on the Sabbath in the synagogue. And there's a man there, and his right hand is shriveled. It's crippled. He can't use it. Luke tells us that it's his right hand, which probably means it's his dominant hand. Now, if it's his left hand and he's right-handed, perhaps he could still work. But if it's his right hand and he's right-handed, chances are he can't work. And in the first century, if you can't work, you have to beg and hope somebody has compassion upon you. It says it's shriveled. It's some kind of muscular atrophy, some kind of paralysis. Luke doesn't tell us how long the condition's been this way. He doesn't even tell us how it happened. He just simply states there's this man in the synagogue, and he's got this hand that's crippled. He can't use it. And if he can't use it, he can't work. And if he can't work, well, he has to beg. So this is a big issue for this man and his family. He goes on to say the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Interesting. In the synagogue that day, the Pharisees and teachers of the law show up. It's a synagogue service. You're supposed to show up to worship. But they show up looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Interesting reason to go to the synagogue, to find an accusation against the one who's speaking that day. The Pharisees seem to be more interested in finding an accusation against Jesus than helping the man with the crippled hand. That's kind of their mindset. It's also the mindset that whatever you're thinking, whatever you're looking for, you're likely to find it. They're looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, and they're about to find such a reason. They watch him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus' opponents have no doubt in his ability to heal. They've probably seen Jesus heal others. They've heard incredible stories of what Jesus has been able to do. The only question for them is Jesus' power to heal from God, or is it from the devil? And that was the question, because if they were to say Jesus' power to heal is from God, then why aren't you following him? They don't want to follow Jesus. So the only alternative left is to say, Jesus is doing those things through the power of Satan. And in Luke chapter 11, Jesus will tell them that's completely absurd. Doesn't even make logical sense. So, they're looking to accuse him. That would be a legitimate reason to take Jesus to court. An accusation that's a legal accusation against him. Then it says Jesus knew what they were thinking. Some people think that, Jesus had this divine insight into what people were thinking, but he didn't really need that in this case. Jesus had grown up hearing about the Pharisees. He knew what they taught. He knew what they believed, and he knew why they were there. It was pretty obvious. So he knew their thought process. He knew their traditions, and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." Now, Jesus could have said, "Gentlemen, it's the Sabbath. So you with the crippled hand, if you will come and meet me as soon as the sun goes down and the Sabbath is over, I will heal your hand. Or come back tomorrow morning and I will bring healing to your hand." He could have said that. And the Pharisees would have no reason whatsoever to throw a fit. But Jesus isn't going to play their game. So he says to the man, "Just get up and stand up in front of everyone so everyone can see you." So the man gets up and he's standing there. And everybody's watching to see what Jesus would do. But before Jesus does anything, he has a question. There's kind of a theme here. Jesus always has a question, doesn't he? And here's his question this time. "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy life?" And when Jesus gives the options, there's no grounds for being neutral. You just can't claim neutrality. You're either going to do good or you're going to do evil. So this is not a question between doing good and doing nothing. It's a question of doing good or doing evil. Because if you do nothing, you are in essence doing evil. If you don't do what's good, you're doing what is evil. So Jesus is saying, if I don't heal this man, if I make him come back tomorrow morning, he gets to live with his condition one more day. That's one more day he doesn't get to work. That's one more day he doesn't get to support his family. That's one more day where the man has to beg. And that's evil, Jesus says. So this is a big challenge for the Pharisees. And Jesus is saying, if it's right to do good on any other day, shouldn't it be right to do good on the Sabbath day? If I'm supposed to do good things on Tuesday, shouldn't I also do good things on the Sabbath day? And if it's wrong to do bad things on Tuesday, isn't it wrong to do bad things on the Sabbath day as well? So what's the Sabbath all about? Is it about doing good or is it about doing evil? And when Jesus asked the question, he had them. Because if they say, "Well, Jesus, the Sabbath is all about doing good," then Jesus would say, "Great, you'll have no problem with me healing this man then." But they can't say the Sabbath is about doing evil, because God could not command something that's evil. So he had them. In verse 10 says, Jesus looked around at them all. It got really silent in the synagogue. And Jesus is looking around going, "Anybody want to answer my question?" No, they don't. Because if they answer the question, they're going to condemn themselves. So then Jesus says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and the hand was completely healed. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He can do good things on the Sabbath. In fact, Jesus would say you should always do good things on the Sabbath. If you can do good things on Tuesday, you can do good things on the Sabbath day as well. Well, the Pharisees are not happy. They're furious. They're beside themselves with anger. Jesus has just outwitted them. Jesus has asked them a question that they can't answer without condemning themselves, because they would have to admit that their rules and regulations are more important than helping people. What's most important, the law or the person? And for the Pharisees, it was always the law. Their laws kept them from doing the right thing. Mark chapter 3, verse 6 says they not only discuss what to do with Jesus, but according to that verse, they plot to kill Jesus. They want Jesus out of the way. Jesus is exposing them. Jesus is showing their own hypocrisy. Jesus gave them a chance to answer the question, but they wouldn't answer it. Because the only answer to the question was, it is right to do good. And we're not going to allow that. And that's a problem. The only answer is to do good. They're more concerned with their traditions than the health and happiness of a handicapped man. That's who they were. And Jesus exposed them. Sometimes we can let things get in the way of helping people. Sometimes we seem to be more concerned about our rules, our regulations, our traditions, than showing love and compassion for people. Jesus says love and compassion for people always comes first. Interesting. The controversy that Jesus ran up against with these religious leaders. So here was a group of people trying to follow God, but they were so entrenched in their traditions and the ways of people and the rabbis that they missed God in the process. And here it was, God in the flesh standing before them, and they're plotting to kill him. They've missed it because of their traditions. Jesus says, open your eyes and see. Have love and compassion. Heavenly Father, thank you for these incredible stories and for Jesus' incredible teaching about what really matters. And Father, I pray that we will take these stories to heart and that our lives would be known for our love and our compassion, not for our religiosity, not for all of the traditions of religion, but for the fact that we really love and care about people. May that be what we in our church are really known for. So, Father, I pray that you'll continue to lead us to do the right thing and to be there for people. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.